Andrew Doyle, thanks so much for being on the Quillette podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I just feel like we live in strange times. If this interview were taking place a couple of years ago, I'd be talking all about left-wing wokeness and, oh, those progressives are so silly. And did you hear about the latest words we're not allowed to use? And your alter ego, Titania McGrath, who we're going to talk about a little later because I don't know, she might be a little bit dormant in recognition of these strange times we live in. But let's cut right to the chase here. You had a Substack article titled, "What is the Woke Right?" Can you answer that question for us?
It's become quite a contentious issue, the phrase woke right, because it sounds counterintuitive. It sounds like an oxymoron. The reason I was talking about that is because I've always perceived the culture war not to be about left versus right, but to be about what John Stuart Mill described as the struggle between authority and liberty. And I think when I've talked about the woke, it's effectively a synonym for anti-liberal in the traditional sense of of the meaning of the term liberal. And so the idea of there being a woke right actually makes complete sense insofar as there are liberals on the right, the left, and everywhere in between. There are also anti-liberals on the right, the left, and everywhere in between. So if you see the key characteristics of the woke, which is effectively that they want to impose their values on the rest of society through authoritarian means, then of course authoritarians exist absolutely everywhere on the political spectrum. The woke left and the woke right, therefore, are simply designations for people who are opposed politically on all sorts of issues, but on the other hand, both believe that authoritarianism is the means by which they can achieve their goals. That's what I was talking about in that article. And, maybe we could get into it because I tried to outline what I believe were the key characteristics of what I was calling the woke right, which isn't a term that I invented, by the way. It's been used quite a lot over the last few years. But it might be quite interesting to talk about what I perceive to be are those key characteristics and where they have similarities with the woke left. Would that be useful?
It would be useful, but first I'm going to blow my own horn, something I do at every opportunity, because as soon as people started using the term woke in scare quotes, I guess a couple of years ago, I started saying, instead of woke, I said anti-liberal progressivism.
Right.
The idea that people who self-identify as progressives and who often substantively have progressive outlook in terms of everything from income distribution to anti-racism and so forth, advocate anti-liberal strategies and slogans in order to achieve their goals. And just, to give a refresher on what liberalism means, because like here in Canada, there's a liberal party, and in the UK, there's capital L liberals and there's small L liberals. And small L liberalism, free speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of conscience, freedom from theocracy and ersatz theocracy. And some people, including you, have identified some of the similarities between progressive wokeism and deflected forms of Christianity. Civil liberties more generally. And there is this impulse. I've often said that liberalism has no dependable constituency, because as soon as you want to shut somebody up or you decide that somebody is dangerous, one of the first things you do is you abandon liberal values. And you say, well, this person doesn't deserve the presumption of innocence because they're such a bad person that we have to get away from that.
Yeah.
So it makes total sense that this same abandonment of liberalism would be seen on the other side of the political spectrum, now that to some extent they're winning the culture war.
I mean, how could it not be? How could it not be? There's never been a time in history where anti-liberalism, which I think you're right, is synonymous with woke. Why anti-liberalism, or when anti-liberalism has been the singular domain of one particular political worldview? I think the authoritarianism is an instinct that we all have, that some of us are socialized out of, or something that, or in other words, that we have to learn to resist it. I think most kids, when they see someone they don't like or hear something they don't like, they just want to shut them up or beat them up or get rid of them. And there is something instinctive about the human condition that lends itself towards authoritarian thinking. And so I think that what the liberal says is we need to cultivate a society in which we resist those temptations. In other words, we're never going to like everyone, but we tolerate. That's why tolerance is such a good thing. Tolerance doesn't imply that you approve of someone. It implies that you understand that you want a plural society. You want everyone to have the right to say what they want, think what they want, do what they want, right up until the point where they are encroaching on the rights of others. That is the essence of liberalism. But as you say, It's complicated because, in Australia, for instance, the Liberal Party is the Conservative Party. In America, liberal is used as synonymous with left wing. The Liberal Democrats in the UK are neither liberal nor democratic. So the definitions are all over the place. And, I would say that, thankfully, there has never been a universally agreed definition of liberalism. There's all sorts of different forms that it takes. But since you've said this, we've clarified very clearly what you mean by liberalism, which is very much in tandem with what I mean by liberalism. And if we're speaking within those terms, then I think it would be difficult to counter the view that, of course, just as a woke left exists, a woke right exists. It makes complete sense to me.
But one of the strange things about the times we live in is that you have different domains in society where, when we use the term, woke left is occupying the commanding heights and the woke right is occupying the commanding heights of other domains. So, like, one example would be in universities. I think it's still fair to say that progressives, including in some cases woke progressives, I want to avoid using that word because it sets off alarm bells for so many people, but say illiberal progressives might occupy the commanding heights in many, say, universities, NGOs, certain social media silos. But then, especially since Trump's reelection, and in red states, you've got political spheres where it's 100% controlled by, call them, illiberal conservatives. So it isn't like this sort of continuous slope where you have illiberal conservatives on one side and liberal progressives on another side, and this big vast plain in the middle where liberals are saying, well, can't we just all be tolerant and exercise political restraint? It's a patchwork of fiefdoms where there's this centrifugal effect where you might have an illiberal right legislature literally across the street from an illiberal left university faculty, and they each regard the other as illiberal because to them illiberalism is people who don't agree with them, and that situation hasn't existed in my lifetime. That's unusual.
It is unusual, and I think that the way to sort of overcome that, just in terms of the way that we conceptualize this, is to stop thinking in terms of left and right. I think the culture war kind of killed off those ideas anyway. I think it's a kind of hangover from the French Revolution. I think we should start thinking in terms of liberty against authority, because what you've just described. We saw it recently with Daryl Cooper, the guy who describes himself as a historian, on Tucker Carlson's show, going on about how Winston Churchill was the true villain of World War II, and people have talked about this being an example of the woke right in action. But how is that any different from the panel that was at Churchill College in Cambridge in 2021, where you had academics from the woke left, people like Priyamvada Gopal and Kahendi Andrews, these activist academics on a platform from the left saying that Churchill was the true villain of World War II. In other words, you have two groups of people who are completely politically antithetical, reaching this identical conclusion, which is to do with effectively the degeneracy of the West. And so to see that notion as left and right doesn't help us, because both groups have reached identical conclusions. However, if you see it in terms of actually they are bedfellows when it comes to this question of liberalism. The woke left have never believed in liberalism. They've liked to say that the word woke just means being alert to social injustice, particularly racism, but they forget to add the caveat, which is, and we want to change that by authoritarian means. That's the key. And of course, that's the same with people on the right who want to reshape the world in accordance with their by authoritarian means. So I think as a good starting point is if we just sort of reconceptualize the culture war as not to do with right and left, then you start to see that authoritarians exist across the spectrum. And the goal, therefore, of those who are critics of the culture war, people like myself, are to challenge authoritarianism as and when it arises, irrespective of political affiliations or tribes, and to be consistent in applying those principles. In other words, not to say because someone on my side has now veered into authoritarianism, we're going to ignore that, but actually apply those principles across the board and say, no, that's not right, wherever it comes from. We need to address it. I think that's going to be the next, as you say, there are great complexities to this next phase of the culture war as woke is dying, which I think it definitely is. What happens next? It's always the same story throughout history. What happens next is the emergence of authoritarianism in another way. It's a kind of a whack-a-mole situation. You deal with it in one regard, and then it turns up somewhere else. We've been through these revolutions before. When I was a kid, it was the right-wing tabloids in the UK, like the Daily Mail or the Daily Express, calling for films to be banned, books to be banned, books to be censored. Now it's left-leaning activist papers like The Guardian or The New Statesman calling for books to be censored, supporting comedy shows being censored online, all the rest of it. The same thing. It's not to do with right and left. It's to do with the people who think that their view has to be imposed and foisted on by force on the rest of society.
You mentioned in passing, I think her name, Professor Gopal. Am I remembering correctly that she's the same academic who started screaming at some minimum wage worker
Yeah,
at her unit? Yeah,
that's exactly right. She at her college, I think he called her ma'am or mom,
yeah,
and she didn't like that. She wanted to be called doctor. And of course, what you had this situation where this very, very privileged, wealthy woman, she comes from wealth, was berating a working class guy because he wasn't being sufficiently deferential. And of course, she dressed it up in the garb of racism.
sure.
Or there was certainly that insinuation there. And that's something that the woke left have managed to do very, very well, insofar as it is a singularly middle class phenomenon, if not upper middle class phenomenon. It's a bourgeois movement, and which is why they talk about intersectionality, but very few of them really care about the class struggle. But they care about their monomania for group identity. So it is an anti-working class movement, which is why I've always taken the view that the woke movement cannot really be said to be left-wing in any meaningful sense. It's not left-wing. The case of Priyamvada Gopal just it says it exactly. Same with the Brexit vote in the UK, where you started having lots of very privileged, wealthy people saying that the working classes know absolutely nothing about politics, and why should we be allowing them to have a say in our country's future or our membership of an international trading bloc? So, yeah, in terms of class, absolutely. I think it's very interesting to note that the woke left has always been anti-working class and therefore anti-left, which is also why thinking in terms of left and right in all of this, you start to get into very muddy quagmires very quickly.
Yeah, and this is something, I mean, it was probably, I guess, a decade ago. I worked briefly at a highly progressive Canadian magazine where I was the kind of a square peg in a round hole. I was the editor-in-chief there for a brief period. And I often felt, even though, my appointment there was controversial because I was seen as, I'm not particularly conservative, but I was certainly seen as more conservative than the status quo there. And yet, ironically, I often found myself as kind of the token Marxist in the room, in the sense that, after half an hour of discussion about like some article written by a grad student about how she'd been misgendered by the photocopier or something like that, I'd say, like, is this something like actual people who have difficulty paying their rent, like, that they worry about? Like, and often, I mean, the people I work with were very nice and respectful, and I think they had good intentions, but they often did speak about working class people in a kind of dismissive way because, well, they don't know about land acknowledgements, they don't know about, they haven't come to terms with their gender identity, they're very cis. And it was sort of like I don't know, I found it very confusing and disorienting because at the time, I naively thought about left and right in terms of things like income inequality and the privilege that comes from having access to capital and so forth.
That's not naive. That's just the traditional left-wing worldview.
Yeah.
What's happened is, since the cultural turn, where that's why we would say that the woke movement is Marxian, I suppose, rather than Marxist, as far as it substitutes money, the economy, class for identity categories, and therefore, of course, you get people who've been incredibly privileged throughout their life berating others.
But you make the point, borrowing from others, that in this so-called woke right movement, there is a kind of strange kind of intersectionality going on where, like, sort of white people are really focusing on their identities as white people and say, I'm from Lutonia and the world hates Lutonians. And like, they have kind of borrowed some of the worst habits of their opponents in some way, haven't they?
Well, I mean, I suppose whenever you have a movement like the woke that has been focused so obsessively on group identity and said that human beings have to be perceived first and foremost through their group identity as opposed to as individuals, as Martin Luther King said, well, then you're going to get that as a response. I mean, how can you then be surprised when the people that you designate as the oppressors, straight white men or whatever it might be, start thinking in terms of group identity in response? I mean, it's absolutely obvious that that's going to happen. And that's something that we are seeing more and more, a lot of people are saying, well, if you're going to talk about Black Lives Matter, then why can't we talk about white lives as well? It was interesting. I noticed that there was a post online from the guy who runs Gab. Is it Andrew Torber?
I I don't know.
I think it would
And
be.
Gab, for those who don't know, Gab, I don't even know if it still exists, was this like right wing alternative to Twitter as it then was,
Yeah,
which gained prominence because when Donald Trump was thrown off Twitter for a time at least, he was on this thing called Gab. Um,
that's right. It was like a kind of, yes, exactly, and it became another echo chamber. By necessity, that sort of happened. But yeah, I've just found this quotation. He put out a message on X, and he said, I've got the actual quotation here. He says, in a multicultural, multi-ethnic society like ours, tribal identity politics is inevitable. Different identity groups will always strive to protect and promote their own interests. This is common sense, and white people are starting to wake up to this reality and realize that if they don't advocate for themselves, no one else will. What's very interesting about that is, I looked through a lot of his messages and tweets and posts. He always capitalizes white, capital W.
there was a
And
big thing about that. Remember those AP Associated Press style guide? There was this big kerfuffle. I forget how it resolved itself about
well, that
they
well
were
that
going to
it,
capitalize black but not white or
right.
something like that. Yeah.
That's a direct. So he is responding directly to the identitarian left's decision to capitalize the word black but not white. This was in the Associated Press. They put out a statement, which obviously, as a style guide, is seen as the go-to for the media. And the Associated Press put out a post saying, "We, in the wake of Black Lives Matter, we're going to capitalize black because there is a shared cultural history there, but we're not going to capitalize white." And of course, this is patently ideological. And lots of media outlets picked up on that and followed suit quite mindlessly, not realizing that they were promoting this really regressive form of politics. But then you also had I remember seeing some social justice activists, I think at the MacArthur Foundation, actually, they wrote a piece saying, oh yes, but we should also capitalize white because otherwise that implies that
It's a
whiteness is sort of the norm or the standard and you have to have equity within grammar. And it got very, very complicated. But the bottom line, I suppose, is what I'm saying is you're getting from the right now things like Torba capitalizing white as a reaction to the woke capitalizing the B of black. In other words, mirroring their tactics, pushing back on their tactics and doing exactly the same thing. Increasingly, I am seeing online this attempt to formulate and promote white identity, look out for our interests according to racial groups. All of this is the mirror image of. This is why we talk about woke left and woke right. I mean, they are both fixated on identity politics and seeing people in terms of demographics and not as individuals, both, which is of course incredibly anti-liberal. And they share that same quality. So we seem to have opened the gateway to the mainstreaming of identitarianism. And now that is being adopted with greater vehemence by people across the political spectrum. We shouldn't be surprised to see that.
So I just want to pick up on that because I think the similitude between progressive illiberalism and call it right wing illiberalism, it breaks down in one respect, which I think is that progressive illiberalism is not a personality cult per se; it's a cult of identity. It's saying like black versus white, gay versus straight. Although the gay versus straight thing is gay men are basically, I mean, they're like Jews and Asians. They're just, they think they got thrown out of the intersectional bus. But it's like trans versus cis, indigenous versus non-indigenous. It's very much about categories. I get the sense that the illiberal conservative trend is more of a personality cult based right now on what Donald Trump says. So you gave the example of this insane person on Tucker Carlson, who I'm sure was nodding appreciatively, talking about how Churchill was the bad guy of World War II or something like that. If Donald, and we know why that's happening, this is sort of like Donald Trump has gone all in with Russia and with the authoritarian impulses that Putin represents. But I get the sense that if Donald Trump tomorrow said, I love Ukraine, I hate Russia, you would have all these illiberal conservatives immediately switch, sort of like, well, Eurasia is our friend, East Asia is the enemy. East Asia has always been the enemy. I don't remember saying anything otherwise. Like, don't you think there's a single personality cult
No,
that,
I don't see it that way. I see
Okay.
it very differently.
Maybe it's because I'm in North America. I know you're
Yeah, I don't see it that way. I see Donald Trump and the MAGA movement as a symptom rather than a cause.
But don't you think that if he changed his mind on an issue tomorrow, he brings with him a lot of these illiberal conservatives in a way that I don't think there's any single, like Judith Butler, Ibrahim X. Kendi, like take your pick. I don't think any of those progressive ideologues could 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 move the entire movement in the way that Trump can move whole swaths of illiberal conservatives.
I'm really not so sure. I mean, I
Really?
see so many arguments going on within Republican movements, within right-wing circles, agreeing and disagreeing over, for instance, Russia, Ukraine, or identity politics, or protectionism, or all sorts of things. I don't think it's the case. I mean, I think Donald Trump won by a landslide because he was appealing firstly because of the Democrats' failures, obviously, but also because he was appealing to he was going to address this massive cultural problem, the woke movement. He was going to tackle it which is something which has never been popular amongst the American population. I think at the height, 8% of the population supported it. So this was a top-down, imposed, unpopular movement that nobody liked. And he was and rather than, the Biden administration went all out gung-ho supporting it, even though Biden had been appointed as the non-woke candidate, supposedly became its biggest cheerleader. And you had a political movement and figure. It meant that actually people held their nose and voted for Donald Trump, even though they dislike him on a personal level. So I think what you're seeing there is not really a populist cult of personality at all. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but I don't think that's the case. I think what we're seeing is he is tapping into issues that the vast majority of people agree with. I mean, if you take the trans issue, he doesn't have to work very hard. He signs an executive order saying that there are only two sexes, that men shouldn't be allowed in women's sports, that men shouldn't be allowed in women's dressing rooms. Well, that's an 80-20 issue. I mean, even if you look at the latest polls on that, even 67% of Democrat voters support Trump on that issue. He's just saying things that are popular. I don't think it is the case that he is an opinion former in that way. I really don't. And I think if he were to say something completely outlandish, he would get an awful lot of pushback, or something that deviates from these consistent anti-woke principles that he's been following. I think he would get an awful lot of pushback for that. And I don't think that it would necessarily automatically. I just don't buy this idea that the public are just following a kind of spiritual leader. I don't think that's the way. I think it's the other way. I think it's the other way round. I think he's going along with the popular sentiment.
I think you're absolutely correct when it comes to issues, the trans issue, for instance. The Russia-Ukraine thing, I'm thinking specifically of Russia-Ukraine, where I don't think a huge percentage of the American electorate went to the polls with extremely strong convictions about the Russia-Ukraine issue. But on that issue, I think Trump, I do think that he weaponized that issue in a very strange way and in a very dangerous way. I mean, to me,
I'm just saying, but if fundamentally your whole policy is America first, and we're not going to be interventionists, and we're not going to involve ourselves in foreign conflicts, the resolution of that conflict, which is let's face it, taking a lot of money from the US, would seem to be in line with everything that he said he was going to do during the election campaign. It doesn't.
I guess, but Ronald Reagan was America first. But for him, and I guess maybe I'm old-fashioned, I still see it this way. Even I'm not American, but being America first or Canada first or the West first or NATO first means defending, in a strict geographical sense, defending Europe from Russian aggression.
Sure, yeah, that's right. But that's not. But to be fair, that's not what Trump was saying, was it?
Yeah,
he was saying. In fact, he said quite explicitly that war should never have happened. I would have been able to stop it, in his sort of blustering way.
Right.
I'll put an end to this on day one, etc. So, I don't think he can be accused of not doing the thing that he campaigned on. Okay. I don't think that's true.
Fair enough.
I think it is exactly what he campaigned on. You can have a debate about the merits and demerits of that approach, but what I don't think you can do is I don't think you can see this as an about turn.
Okay. So I want to get back to the present moment, but I just want to deviate into some futurism here, where I don't want to do a lot during this discussion on the trans issue. At Quillette, we've covered it a lot. I think we would probably agree that it was ludicrous for the Democrats to stick with the party line on the idea that men can become women by changing their pronouns as if it were a magic spell.
And they still are, by the way.
Yeah, it's insane. They're already hard at work losing the next election over this issue. I've seen some polling data that suggests that in some swing states, maybe the entire presidential election, that this issue actually helped swing the election.
Well, did you see the analysis of the from a Democrat think tank about the advertisement that Trump put out?
Well, the they them, yeah,
The they them thing.
Kamala's
So Kamala is for they them, Donald Trump is for you.
devastating.
And that advert was shown to actuate a bigger swing in terms of opinion than anything else. This was a culture war election, I think.
But my question, not to dwell on this too much, but my question is, if we take that as an issue that's emblematic of progressive overconfidence and overreach in terms of, yeah, we can pretend that men can become women and we're still going to win elections. We're going to bring people around on this. We're on the right side of history. Biological sex is a myth. It was imposed by white people on indigenous societies. And yeah, like this, this is a winning issue. We're going to stick with it. Looking into the future, what is the equivalent issue for conservatives where they get overconfident, where they depart from reality, that they go into the realm of science fiction in a way that like 90% of people are like, what the hell are you talking about? What is the equivalent issue for conservative woke overreach?
It would probably be the imposition or the erosion of of secularism. It would be the imposition of some kind of state sanctioned Christianity, I suppose. I mean, that to me strikes me as the equivalent insofar as and again,
Well, sticking with the similitude between sort of woke theocracy and pseudoscience versus the more literal theocracy that you would get from a conservative, social conservative.
Well, there are two things there. There is the belief system that this discussion entails, and there's how the belief system is implemented in society. The how is about authoritarianism, as I've said, insofar as, the pseudo-religious belief in a gendered soul has been imposed from the top down by the Democrats. What you've described there in terms of them thinking that they can just demand that the public accept these...
They'll get around to this. The muggles will get around to this.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, what that is that's bourgeois paternalism combined with authoritarianism.
And by the way, sometimes I point out to conservatives, sometimes they're right. Gay marriage 30 years ago was seen as this elite, la-di-da college campus thing. Now, at least here in Canada, my conservative friends are totally fine with gay marriage.
Yeah, but that's that's because gay marriage was based on the idea that the sexual orientation is something that is remarkably
100%. I'm just saying
it's
that
real. It's something that you can measure.
Just saying that sometimes you do get a situation where the elites say, "Oh, they'll come around to us eventually," and sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're right.
Sometimes they're absolutely right, but we can be pretty sure they won't be right when it comes to a supernatural belief system.
Yeah, that's true.
So, I know you don't want to talk too much about the trans issue, but, simple question, which is why is it that everyone who is implementing these policies in healthcare and public policy and the rest of it, no one can define gender identity. No one can tell you what it actually is. They're, enforcing hate speech laws in Europe on the basis of this supernatural belief that they can't even define.
It's the spark of the divine within us.
Right. So obviously, ultimately, that is never going to be persuasive. What you can do is you can terrorize a populace into feigning belief in such a system. In Stalinist Russia, you can terrorize people into towing the party line, but it doesn't mean they secretly believe it. It doesn't mean they secretly think it or accept it. And that's what's happened with the gender issue. I mean, very, very few people believe in such a thing as a gendered soul.
Can I?
So just to make that comparison, the reason why I say that I think the similarity would be a new a resurgence of Christianity. And I would also add to that probably a resurgence of performative Christianity. I mean, if you look at Roger Scruton wrote a book called England, an Elegy, where he quite neatly referred to England in the past tense throughout, which makes the very clear point that he thinks the country is dead. But he talks about the Church of England and how the Church of England was never really about belief in God. And a lot of sort of prominent clergymen didn't really believe in God. It was about the community and it was about the rules and it was about decorum.
Recusancy.
Right.
And until well into the Tudor era, you had people, you were fined if you didn't show up on Sunday.
Yeah, but that's right.
You weren't fined because in your soul you weren't a Christian. You were fined because this is what's done and you're not doing what's done.
Right. Exactly. So it's performance. This is what I mean by, a lot of what I'm seeing now, I come from a Christian family. I know a lot of Christians. There are people who I know who have recently converted to Christianity, who genuinely have had some kind of experience that has changed them and that they have faith. I also see an awful lot of people who are adopting Christianity as an identity category, who don't believe in God at all, or at least nothing they've said to me convinces me that they do. And I'm someone who comes from a religious background, so I'm sensitive to this because for me, faith is an authentic feeling which is not tethered to evidence or reason. I think most religious people I know would accept that it's an unreasonable belief, but it is a belief they nonetheless hold. But I'm seeing a lot of people who are adding the cross to their social media profiles, posting out Christ is King as a way to taunt Jews or whatever it might be. People using the slogans of Christianity in a way that is anti-Christian, as far as I can see, anti the teachings of Christ, as a divisive and aggressive,
But in
weaponizing.
that context, in that context, the cross becomes a kind of he/him land acknowledgement.
Quite. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So what I'm not doing here is denigrating religious belief, religious faith. I'd say the majority of the population of the planet hold religious faith sincerely. I'm talking about this performative perversion of religion as an identity category, as a tribal marker. And I'm seeing more and more evidence that is going to be the thing. And I mean, I've heard lots of people talking about what is best for American society. I've heard people on the woke right, if we're going to call them that, say that what we need is a re-establishment of Christian norms in schooling, in public policy. In other words, what we say is you're free to believe what you want, but you're going to have to follow these basic Christian ideas. And that to me is anathema to the Constitution, to what the great experiment of freedom that is the United States of America. So I would say that if we're attempting to anticipate where the equivalent of the gendered soul thing will happen on the right, it's going to be this. It's going to be, because again, with the gendered soul thing, we know that the vast majority of politicians who have been pushing this don't really believe it.
No, they don't.
They absolutely don't. If they did, when they're asked what is a woman, they wouldn't panic. I mean, you can see the fear in their eyes. You know, they can, oh my God, I might have to tell the truth. What am I going to do about that? So it's not an authentically held belief. By the way, I'm not saying that nobody holds that belief. Some people do, but generally speaking, it's not an authentic belief.
I mean, I think there might be 20 or 30% of people who pretend to believe it, and of those, maybe 1% actually do believe it.
If 1%, I think you'd be hard pushed to even get the numbers that high. But and I think that, look, I'm not Mother Shipton. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but it might be. I'm just going on what I've seen in terms of the chatter online from the online right, from the woke right, and they seem to think that liberalism is to blame, that wokeness arose because we were too liberal.
Yeah.
My view is the opposite. My view is wokeness arose because we failed to be liberal. We failed to apply the principles of liberalism. Wokeness represents a failure of liberalism, not evidence of its excesses. So, and I think a lot of them are now saying, well, what we need is an alternative authoritarian system, which will prevent that from rising. In other words, someone has to be in power. It may as well be us. Whereas, what I would like to see is a truly liberal society where everyone can do whatever they want within the confines of the rule of law, and so long as they're not encroaching on other people's rights. And also, that doesn't mean, by the way, a kind of free-for-all. It doesn't mean what Milton called license. You know, Milton had this distinction between liberty and license. It's an ancient Christian idea. Liberty doesn't mean a free-for-all. You can do whatever you want. You should have no consideration for the rest of the community. What my idea of liberalism is the idea of fostering a society within which we encourage community and we encourage social responsibility, and we live within the rule of law, and we support each other, but that we are free to break the social contract if we so desire, so long as we're not encroaching on others' rights. But we'll also face the consequences of that, which usually mean just ostracism or becoming a bit of a pariah. You know, that's the liberal system, which hasn't really happened as yet.
Look, my attitude toward traditional religion has become very complicated. Not in terms of my personal beliefs. I'm not an observant religious person, but you know, the old adage that when a person abandons religion, it leaves a God-shaped hole in their brain, and so they become highly vulnerable to ersatz religions, totalizing dogmas, whether it's Marxism or they like go all in on Gaza or gender weighing or they adopt a different kind of religion. You know, I once spoke with these two Jehovah's Witnesses who were ostracized by their family because they wanted to go to university. They stopped being Jehovah's Witnesses, and these were brothers. They told me, they said, when we arrived on campus, the first person who handed us a pamphlet, that was going to be our new religion.
Yeah.
And it happened to be evangelical Christians, and for 2 years they became evangelical Christians, and then they got rid of that, and then they became like very devout atheists and rationalists and skeptics, and that kind of became their new church. But there does seem to be this thing that we all need a church of some kind, even if we don't call it a church. But liberalism, for all its benefits, is not a church.
I think that's inevitable. I mean, you won't have escaped your attention that the most vehement adopters of the genderist belief have been the new atheists, have
Yeah,
been the humanist societies, who
yeah.
have been really zealots.
They need a god. They need a god.
And I don't suppose it is really about a god necessarily, but it is about purpose and it is about meaning.
Yeah,
Um,
a movement.
a movement, right?
Because
And things
atheism
like,
often is an anti-movement.
yeah, but well, similarly to liberalism. I mean, you mentioned that liberalism doesn't offer you a church; it cultivates freedom of thought, but it does offer you meaning. And so, to me, it is a kind of intellectual death to outsource my agency to another person's set of rules. And therefore, to me, the liberal system is the preferable. I don't want to be following somebody else or from someone else's diktats or looking to someone else to decide how I ought to behave. But by the same token, I want a sense of social responsibility, and I want to live within a society of human beings where we are cooperative. And so, I think yes, liberalism is not a church, but what liberals say is you are free to join whatever church you want. You're free to believe whatever you want. You're free to do whatever you do within the rule of law. That to me seems like a no-brainer. But I'm constantly banging my head against the wall because as far as I can see, the predominant instinct within humanity is no, I've got all the right answers and I want everyone else to live by my rules. And that's coming now from the right in just the same way that it came from the left during the woke era.
I promised I wouldn't talk about Gaza and the Middle East, because once you start talking about that, it's all you talk about. But I have friends and relatives who Zionism or anti-Zionism have become effectively their religions, and it's all they talk about on social media. It's all they talk about in person, and it's a real issue. And in some cases, their view, I actually agree with their views, but it's difficult to be with them because they're such zealots. And by the way, and some of my friends, in this case, some of these are Jewish people, but it's absolutely clear to me that it's a phenomenon that's essentially separate from their Jewish belief system. Zionism has, I happen to be a Jew by ancestry, and I'm generally Zionistic in my outlook, but more and more I see these two things as different churches or different shuls, I guess.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's why Greta Thunberg was able to transition so easily from environmental activism to
Overnight.
anti-Israel activism, because it's part of the omnicause. It's the same,
Do
predictable.
you have the same thing in England, where the only people I see still wearing masks here in Toronto are like anti-Israel, effectively pro-Hamas, sort of gender wang, often like kind of exercise deprived people with like three masks. They're all obsessed with Gaza. They're all obsessed with masking. They all have three genders, and it's become kind of this Borg. Like, is it the same thing in England, where those three issues have? It's like the same group of very unhappy looking people who kind of coalesce.
Yeah, because it is. There's a reason why they call it the omnicause, because when someone tells you their opinions on, the LGBTQIA plus community, or their opinions on Israel, Palestine, or abortion, or whatever, you can pretty much 99% of the time identify their opinions on every other subject without being told.
Yeah, except in these cases, these are very fringe subjects. Like only 1 or 2% of society agrees with Hamas. Only 1 or 2% of people is still masking. Only
Right.
Only 1 or 2% of people have unpronounceable pronouns. But
That's why it's so
they all
easy.
seem to be the same people now.
Yeah, but that's why it's so easy to identify. Someone's still wearing a mask. Someone,
But it's like a cult.
It is but that's exactly what it is. I mean, it is exactly that thing I was talking about of outsourcing your decision making to somebody else.
But what's the equivalent for conservatives? So the Holy Trinity I just referenced, the keffiyeh, the mask, and the weird pronouns. Like, what is that Holy Trinity? What is the equivalent for conservatives?
Okay, well, the equivalent for conservatives is probably something like the Groyper movement.
What's that? That sounds like a dermatological condition or something like
doesn't
that.
it? They're the ones who put the frogs, the Pepe frogs, up online.
What is the Pepe? I never understood the Pepe frog thing.
Like, no, I never understood it. And
what is that? Is that a liberal thing or a conservative thing?
It's a conservative thing, but
is it?
It was an internet meme, and the problem with it is that it's kind of spilled out into
What does
other
that mean?
areas.
What does the frog mean? Because the only here in Canada, the only people I knew who were obsessed with frogs were actually progressives who were like denouncing frogs. But I never figured out what the frog was supposed to mean.
No, and look, this is an internet culture that I'm not part of. So I tread into this quite warily. My experience of it is of being piled upon by groypers, where I had a lot of sort of groypers and they kept posting images of frogs at me for
Oh.
a sort of 24-hour period. And the Pepe frog became associated with the dissident right. Some people post it in as a sort of comical meme. Some people post it to provoke. There's a faction within that see it as a symbol of white nationalism, ethno-nationalism.
Is the frog like the same as Kermit the Frog? Like where's
No,
the
no, it's a Pepe frog.
what's the
It's
what
it,
is where does it come from?
I don't know where it comes from, but it's a different. It's not a Kermit frog.
Okay.
It's a Pepe frog. Very specifically, you know it when you see it.
Yeah, I've seen the image
Yeah,
of it.
yeah,
It kind of
yeah.
looks like Kermit. I just never understood what it meant.
It's not Kermit. Kermit's far too wholesome.
Okay.
Kermit is definitely not a white nationalist.
I have issues with Kermit, but they have nothing to do with politics.
Well, it'll be to do with the crossbreeding with a pig, probably.
Yeah.
Which is pretty vile.
It's weird. Yeah.
Morally reprehensible. But I think he is, the Pepe frog thing is very much a provocative internet meme, which has been embraced by a group who call themselves groypers. If you look at the groyper discussions and discourse, when I've been piled on by them, there's a lot of anti-gay stuff. A lot of groypers went at me for being a sodomite. There's a lot of anti-Jewish stuff. There's a lot of anti-black stuff. So all of that is what we used to call alt-right, which again was a complicated term because it was used in different ways. But I suppose if you're looking at a fringe group equivalent to the mask-wearing, progress pride-flying woke, then it's that. It's the dissident right.
The groypers.
It's that faction of the dissident right, not the more sort of intellectual dissident right, but the shit posters, I suppose. Then you get that. And even within that group, I mean, I know people who are shit posters and trolls who have not a racist bone in their body and they're not interested in it. But they're part of these online communities where they regularly see racism and anti-Semitism and white supremacy, and they just their response is to mock it and to take the piss. But I think that's the equivalent of the woke, because for a number of reasons, and this is what we might call the woke right, I suppose. One of the reasons is that they, like I said before, they're obsessed with group identity. They're obsessed with the white identity, heterosexual identity, the idea that gays are degenerate, that the LGBTQ thing, that's all degeneracy, the idea that Jews run the world. They always come back to these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. They're all very resentful. They've got the politics of grievances, the politics of resentment, which is exactly the same as what the woke left have. They hate liberals. They hate the idea of liberalism. They think there should be very strict laws in accordance with what they believe. The anti-Semitism thing, as I say, is a very major thing.
Well, every liberal movement eventually comes around to anti-Semitism.
Exactly, which is why you get that completely normalized anti-Semitism on the woke left and completely normalized on the woke right as well. Now we're moving into this, and the purity spirals as well, the idea that everyone must believe exactly what we believe, or we're going to pile on them for ages, which is what happened to me. I've been piled on by the groypers, and I've been piled on by the woke left and the pronoun flag people. They're equally vehement, equally vicious, and equally intolerant of the very idea that someone could disagree with their worldview. They are cults, and they behave like cults. And they both seem to share this complete disdain for the West. Like, they think that the West is responsible for the rise of wokeness.
And Putin was just reacting to the West's provocations when he invaded Ukraine. That's another precept they often talk about.
Yes, exactly. And which is why they say, well, maybe it would have been better if Hitler would have won the Second World War. Maybe that was the start of our problems. You remember that? I mentioned that Daryl Cooper guy who was on Tucker Carlson's show. I mean, when that opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics happened and you had those drag queens doing that parody of the Last Supper, the Da Vinci painting.
Oh my God.
And he posted an image of that next to an image of Hitler marching into Paris, saying that the opening ceremony of the Paris Olympics was far worse.
It's funny. Wow, I don't know what to do with that. But I will say that the only other person I know of who has expressed ambiguity about the question of like whether it would have been good if the Nazis had won World War II is there's this crazy leftist in Canada. Her name is Nora Loretto. I actually don't know what became of her. She was prominent maybe as recently as like a year ago. But she actually tweeted, she said, I'm paraphrasing here, one of the benefits of Hitler winning World War II would have been that, there would have been less geopolitical space for American imperialism to rise up in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it's crazy. And to me, that I remember thinking is like a cautionary tale of what happens to your brain when you become sort of you join a cult like this. But it sounds like there's a
Yeah.
direct analog on the right with people actually like musing about, well, maybe if Hitler had won, we wouldn't have drag queens at the Olympics.
We wouldn't have degeneracy. I mean, you know that Hitler was, you know,
Well, he was obsessed with it. He thought it was
he's
a bacillus.
obsessed with degeneracy, degenerate art, the idea of censorship of art, which is exactly what the woke do. The woke right are the same. I mean, we're seeing this an awful lot. I mean, wait, isn't there? I just read the other day. So there's a is it the Texas A&M University, which has now banned drag performances on campus,
which is crazy. Drag is fine. It's funny and it's interesting. I like drag. It's not for kids, but it's
not. I agree. I've liked lots of. I've been to lots of drag shows.
It's
Drag
fine.
is totally fine. So the drag issue is a very good example of this. And again, we were talking earlier about, the Andrew Doyle example, the idea of white identitarians borrowing the tactics of black identitarians, and how it one reaction produces the other. The drag queen, the politicization of drag, I think, is a really interesting way in which this has happened societally. If you take, for instance, I don't know if you saw this. There was a viral clip a couple of years ago from a church in Texas where there was a ceremony going on where there was a group of drag queens, extreme drag, like with frocks and massive wigs and makeup, standing on the altar while the priest led the congregation in a call and response about how we will support the oppressed and marginalized drag community and we will support the LGBT. And these were Christians. And what you saw there was this sanctification of drag as an oppressed identity group. More and more, you've seen drag queens saying that they should be a protected characteristic. That
So
drag is somehow innate.
Step back from this, because my family historically, every year during the summer, we go to this town in the state of Maine, the U.S. state of Maine, called Ogunquit, which for reasons I can't explain has historically been there's a lot of gay men who come there for vacation. It's a beach town. And as a result, there's 2 or 3 cabaret bars where they have drag performances. There's like 17 people who live in the town and they have 3 drag cabarets, right? And when I was a kid, this is like totally normal. And I just like, these are gay men having fun. It's an art form. It's like going to the musical theater. It's like anything else. But I never thought it. And I don't think the performers themselves thought of it as more than, this is a way of expressing myself.
Yeah. It's the tradition of drag.
Then we got this movement, and in Canada it absolutely took off, where suddenly they became these kind of like sacred vessels of queerness.
Yeah.
Despite the fact, and I'm not part of the LGBT community, so it's not for me to say, but if I were, I would say, hold on, we already have G in the LGBT acronym. The fact that these are gay men who happen to be wearing women's clothing doesn't change the fact that they're gay men. It doesn't change them into a different kind of creature.
No, but that's the sanctification of identity. It's the equivalent of non-binary. Non-binary is not a thing. Non-binary is like being a goth or a punk.
Right.
It's not a thing that is innate. So to say that being a drag queen is somehow innate is to say that identity is prioritized over material.
Do you know what two-spirit is? Does that term have any currency in England?
I mean, not really. It's an indigenous American.
No. Well, it's mostly Canadian, I would say, but it was essentially invented in the 70s and popularized mostly by white people. But there was a trade union here in Canada, I think it was elementary school teachers, who they commissioned researchers to spend a year trying to define what it meant to be two-spirit. And I read their report, which is hilarious, although unintentionally so, saying that, yes, being two-spirit is this holy, sacred, wonderful thing, but we have no idea what it is, except to the extent that there are 2 requirements to be two-spirit. 1, you have to be indigenous. 2, you have to be anti-colonial. But aside from that, we have no idea whether it's a gender or sexual orientation.
Well, exactly.
It's essentially a political, it's basically saying I'm kind of maybe confused about my sexuality and what I like to wear, and I'm indigenous and I hate Donald Trump. So that's how is that the same as being gay? Like, how is that the same as being born into like a fundamentally different sexual orientation?
This gets to the nub of the issue with the culture war, the monomania over identity. That's all it is. Drag queens are not oppressed. Drag queens have never been oppressed. And what they are, like two-spirit, like non-binary, like anything else, just well, actually, drag is slightly different because it's an art form. And so, but I think that conflict sort of really, I mean, actually, I should qualify this. The reason why this has happened largely, and the reason why, as we've seen, support for gay rights is plummeting in America, support for gay marriage. We have currently at least 5 states in the US are trying to repeal same-sex marriage. So all of this is happening because we have this thing called the LGBT plus community, which is not a thing, by the way, but the excesses of this kind of drag queen story hour, reading to children, sexualized performances for children, fetishistic mainstreaming, all of that is now being blamed on gay people, where of course it's got nothing to do with gay people by and large. It's to do with this identitarian, sex-obsessed movement. So when it comes to drag, I mean, the drag artists that I've known have always been deeply subversive, waspish, offensive, politically incorrect, all of the things that the woke are not. And what's been very interesting is that because woke acts like a virus and turns any institution that it touches according to its whims, it's done the same to drag. It has somehow managed to sanitize drag, to get drag performers sitting in front of children reading stories. And in tandem with that, you've got a very small number, but some drag artists who are performing overly sexualized performances for children, because at the heart of queer theory is the idea that there should be no boundaries, and that includes age of consent boundaries. Yeah. So you have this horrible conflation of genuinely criminal notions of sexuality being interpolated with a broader spectrum of sexual orientation.
But they're acting out the darkest paranoias of traditional homophobes. I mean, traditional homophobes...
Exactly. But that is why gay people are the people who are most angry about all of this. That's why that's why there is a direct conflict between the LGB and the TQ.
So this is one of my questions. So I hate to interrupt you, but I had this on my question list, which is that some of the most principled defenders of liberalism, people who attacked left-wing liberalism early, like 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, and people who are now on the barricades against right-wing liberalism are gay men. So here in Canada, there's a Quillette contributor. His name is Alan Stratton. He's a well-known author, and yourself. Now, by the way, there are also some gay men who, for whatever reason, gone, like Dave Rubin, who have gone pretty far onto the other side. But it's an interesting phenomenon to observe because I'm projecting here, but they resent the fact that, like, in some cases, Alan's a little older than us. He spent his whole life trying to gain acceptance as a gay man and gained it in Canada, where, gay marriage, God, it's been 2005 maybe. I mean, it's totally uncontroversial here. And then suddenly you have people who at least implicitly are tarring the LGBT movement. It's, I think, forced teaming is what they call it. It says, no, you're all part of the queer movement, which means you're all part of this movement to get, drag performers teaching math to the elementary school students, because that's part of what it is to be an LGBT champion. It means you need...
That's the risk of forced teaming two groups of people that are completely antithetical, because the Q plus, the idea of queer theory, the idea of gender identity, all of these things, the end goal of that is the eradication of homosexuality.
Well, James Cantor, who's a sexologist here, he happens to be a gay man here in Toronto. I mean, he spent his life counseling people on issues related to sex, and he's been horrified to see this.
Yeah, of course, because if your entire rights movement is predicated on the belief, not the belief, but the fact that in any given society a minority of people are innately attracted to the same sex, if another movement comes along and says, actually, sex doesn't exist, it's all about a spirit, a gender identity, that is the demolition of homosexuality and gay rights. That is why friends of mine who are still on Grindr and these gay hookup sites are having to go through lots of women who think they're men on a gay men's website. Similarly, lots of lesbian dating sites now have men with beards on saying that they're lesbians. It's illegal now in Australia for lesbians to gather without men. All of this stuff is so... I mean, I'm going to say the word. It's homophobic. Yeah. Because I don't normally like phobias. The idea of diagnosing something as a phobia is normally a way of shutting down debate. But if the medicalization of predominantly gay youth, because they're gay, straightening them out like they do in Iran on the NHS, if that isn't homophobic, I don't know what is. We know that between 80 and 90% of adolescents who were referred to the Tavistock Paediatric Gender Clinic in London, an NHS clinic, 80 to 90% of those adolescents were same-sex attracted. We know that from the Cass review. We know that overwhelmingly, gender nonconformity in youth is a reliable predictor of homosexuality in later life. And those are the people who are being told, you're probably born in the wrong body. We need to heterosexualize you, fix you. The entire Q plus movement is an anti-gay movement. And so therefore, when you put those two things together, when you say we're talking about the LGBTQIA plus community, you're putting together gay people with the people who want to eliminate gay people. You're saying that they're the same, and then you're blaming gay people for the depredations of those who want to see them eliminated. It's perverse.
And NHS, meaning National Health Service, it's the publicly funded health service in Britain, and we won't even get into the I of the acronym, which is intersex, which is a medical condition essentially, but for some they've turned it into a gender identity. Okay, so before I let you go, I want to talk to you about something I didn't realize before prepping for this interview, which is that you were teaching a course at a Florida university on, are you still doing that? So this is about progressive illiberalism. Are you still teaching that course?
No, it was a short course that I did in January at the New College of Florida, and it was a course on wokeness, and there was a lot of media attention, which I kind of missed a lot of this. Apparently, the president of the college was interviewed about it. There was a hit piece in the Guardian about it, specifically targeting me. People were very angry about a course that they hadn't attended and knew nothing about. It was very interesting.
Can I ask you? So, just generally speaking, does it feel weird and maybe even slightly wrong to continue to lampoon, analyze, dissect left-wing wokeness now that Donald Trump is president of the United States again? When, like, here at Quillette, we have these discussions all the time on our Slack channel among editors. It's the greatest threat to liberalism now is not people like Professor Gopal. It's people like Donald Trump. Yeah.
There are two things, aren't there? I mean, the first thing is, just because one thing is more important than another, that doesn't mean that you neglect the other thing.
Yeah.
We can talk about more than one thing at once. And for me, the key question is about standing up to authoritarianism wherever it emerges. So that means I'll continue to talk about it on the left and the right. The other thing is, we don't know what this next phase of the culture war will be, but it's very much looking like a rift is opening up between the old world and the new. It feels a bit like a Henry James novel. We've got America going in one direction under Trump, and you've got Europe doubling down and going in the other direction under the EU, the European Union.
Along with Canada. Don't forget Canada. We're on Team Europe now.
Yeah, that's true. So let's call it an Axis and Allies thing, but maybe more neutral terms.
Although let's stay away from that. But it is some forced teaming here, and the guy doing the forcing is Trump, because by slapping all these tariffs on Canada, even conservatives in Canada now despise Trump because he's trying to tank our economy with these stupid tariffs.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Well, I think that's a whole other issue, though, from the culture war issue, insofar as I think, we've had the EU wants to ramp up censorship, has continually attempted to do so. The UK government is really going for it in its authoritarian direction, is really pushing for greater restrictions on speech. They've quite literally thrown rapists and violent criminals out of jail to make room for people who've posted offensive memes.
We've got grandmas, the police visiting senior citizens because they posted the wrong thing on Facebook.
Visiting journalists are posting the wrong thing on Facebook. The UK government is an authoritarian government. It's not tyrannical, it's not fascist, but it is authoritarian. But then on the other hand, every major Western political party has authoritarianism baked into it to some degree or another. So this is why I think saying that because Trump is in power, we shouldn't talk about the woke left is to ignore Europe and Canada, where it is still very much predominant. I mean, just yesterday, there was a news story about the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in the UK, which is the charity responsible for many properties connected with Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon, and also museum and archival materials relating to his life. And they're saying that they're now launching a decolonization project because they think that Shakespeare is too associated with white supremacy, and they need to deal with the fact that he's full of homophobic and racist ideas. Right. So this is, just as you think woke is dying, in the UK and in Europe, they're ramping it up and going as far as they can. I mean, that's a conflict that I think is going to be very, very interesting. And I think if we should be focusing on the potential threats to freedom that might emerge from the Trump administration. I'm seeing some signs of it already in terms of some of the arrests that are being made, the lack of transparency about the arrests that are being made. with student protesters and that kind of thing. And then in the European and Canadian context and Australia, you have the quite overt threat to free speech, the complete dismissal of free speech as a concept. I mean, Ursula von der Leyen, who is the unelected head of the European Commission, talking about a democracy shield where she wants to censor, or what she calls pre-bunk language online so that people never see it, right? It's like pre-crime.
Yeah,
But the idea is that she's talking about censorship. She's saying, I want to censor materials online. So you remember, the EU is an authoritarian body. It's a bloc that has a track record, a historical record of whenever various independent countries vote a certain way, they say, no, you got it wrong. Let's go back and do that again. They did that in Greece. They did that in Ireland. They did that in Denmark. They have this thing. They tried to do it with the UK and Brexit, right? So it is an authoritarian, bureaucratic, centre-right international trading bloc that is undemocratic fundamentally. You can't vote out Ursula von der Leyen because she wasn't voted in.
I gotta say, pre-bunk is a fantastic euphemism, right up there with gender affirmation.
Which is that? Sorry,
gender affirmation.
No, but what was the euphemism you were talking about?
Pre-bunk. I mean,
pre-bunking is terrifying. Pre-bunking it's in the dystopian lexicon.
There's a certain brilliance to it. It's because you're assuming it's a falsehood. So it's like, well, we're just saving you the time. Since we know this is a lie, we're just saving you the time of not having to process the lie.
Well, the EU is convinced that Russian bots swing elections, and you've seen evidence of bot farms in Russia.
By the way, this is a real problem, though. Like, I mean, to give these EU commissars their due, like, this isn't exactly a made-up problem. Like, it's
the impact of it is made up. Insofar as it's absolutely true that there are Russian bot farms putting out misinformation deliberately to try and stir up trouble. It's not true that people vote according to posts.
I've seen studies. Actually, I've seen studies that suggest that the actual impact is negligible.
Yeah, of course it is, because propaganda doesn't work unless people are already pre-inclined to those views. I mean, in the UK with Brexit, for ages we had politicians saying that Russian bots swung it this way. Ben Bradshaw, a Labour politician, stood up in Parliament and said that it was because of Russian bots. It wasn't. Nobody voted because of Facebook posts. Nobody voted because of something that some bot had said to them. We've just had the election in Romania annulled, just cancelled, because they think it was swung by Russian bot farms. What it means is that the EU does not trust the people. It's like what J.D. Vance said to the Munich Security Conference. He was dead right, by the way. He said, you need to stop running away from your own voters. You need to stop being afraid of the electorate. You need to trust them to deal with the fact that sometimes there's going to be information that's correct. Sometimes there's going to be information that isn't correct. And the Democrats have the same problem. Tim Walz, in that vice presidential debate with J.D. Vance, stood up and said that hate speech and misinformation are not covered by the First Amendment. Yes, they are.
Of course they are.
And what's shocking about that is in the official CBS transcript of that debate, that bit was taken out as though he never said it. You've had John Kerry talking about how the First Amendment is a major block to dealing with disinformation. And of course, you've got the added problem that the people who complain the most about disinformation are often the people most responsible for it. People like the BBC, people like The Guardian, people like the EU, who are happy to put out false information to control the narrative.
They'll call the Cass Review misinformation.
They already have. And lots of people have said that it's far right and all the rest of it. A rigorous 4-year study by one of the top paediatricians in the UK, who didn't have skin in the game and was chosen for that reason, who was coming at this objectively, who produced a very measured and thorough and rigorous study. And you've got groups in America like WPATH just saying that this is just far right, or just trying to dismiss this as unscientific. It is the pinnacle of a scientific study. It did all the right things. It should have changed the debate for good. It should have been the end of gender-affirming care.
To some extent,
but there's still a battle to be fought there. And so what I'm ultimately saying is, yes, there is the threat of authoritarianism from a Trump administration. There would be if the Republicans or the Democrats are in charge. It's the case in both of them are bad. Trump has said that he wants to lock people away for a year if they burn the national flag. He said that in 2016. He said it again in the latest campaign. He said he wants to try and change the libel laws to make it easier to sue his critics. He has an authoritarian streak in the way that Kamala Harris has an authoritarian streak. Tim Walz has an authoritarian streak. Joe Biden most definitely had an authoritarian streak. But just because Elon Musk and Donald Trump are taking a wrecking ball to the authoritarian excesses of the woke left, that doesn't mean the woke left magically disappears, because you've still got its influence in America, in the universities most notably, and in the media, it's still very much deeply embedded. This isn't something you can just pick apart overnight. And as I say, in Europe and Canada and Australia, it seems to be the case that the response to the Trump presidency is to ramp up woke left authoritarianism. So this is why I say, and I come back to what I said at the very start, let's stop thinking in terms of right and left. Let's start thinking in terms of how do we tackle authoritarianism wherever it emerges, because there is no major party in the West that isn't authoritarian to one degree or another. So this is going to be a perennial battle.
Andrew Doyle, thank you so much for being on the Quillette podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it.